Nearly 100 years after Sandy Irvine vanished on the slopes of Mount Everest, a groundbreaking discovery has reignited the greatest mystery in mountaineering history. In September 2024, a National Geographic team, led by famed climber Jimmy Chin, stumbled upon an old boot and sock emerging from the Central Rongbuk Glacier. Inside was a label that read AC Irvine, confirming the partial remains of the 22-year-old climber who disappeared alongside George Mallory during their historic 1924 summit attempt. Could this discovery finally reveal whether the duo reached Everest's peak before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay did in 1953? But before we dive into this groundbreaking discovery, let's take a quick look at the history of this historical expedition. In 1924, a young man named Sandy Irvine set out on an expedition that would become one of the most legendary and tragic stories in the history of mountaineering. It was the third British attempt to conquer Mount Everest, a mountain no one had ever reached the summit of before. For Irvine, barely 22 years old, it was a chance to be part of something historic. But it was also a mission from which he would never return. Born in Birkenhead, Cheshire, Irvine came from a family with deep intellectual roots. His father, William Ferguson Irvine, was a respected historian, and his mother, Lillian, came from an old, distinguished Cheshire family. Though he grew up surrounded by academic influences, Irvine's interests lay in more practical areas, engineering and the outdoors. From an early age, his ability to fix and improve mechanical devices set him apart. He even caught the attention of the War Office during World War I by designing a synchronization gear that allowed machine guns to fire through the propeller of an airplane without damaging the blades. He was a born problem solver. But it wasn't just engineering that Irvine excelled at. He was also a natural athlete. While studying at Shrewsbury School and later at Merton College, Oxford, he became an outstanding rower. In 1923, he was part of the Oxford team that won the prestigious Oxford-Cambridge boat race, a rare victory for Oxford during that era. His rowing skills would have been enough to make him famous, but it was his interest in mountaineering that would shape his legacy. Irvine's first taste of real adventure came when he joined the Merton College Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen in 1923. This expedition, led by the experienced climber Noel Odell, was a test of endurance and skill in an environment that mirrored some of the harsh conditions found in the high altitudes of the Himalayas. Irvine's performance on this Arctic journey impressed everyone, especially Odell. Not only did he handle the physical demands of the trip, but his ingenuity with equipment, whether it was repairing stoves or modifying climbing gear, was unmatched. Because of his success in the Arctic, Irvine's name came up when the British were planning their next attempt on Everest. The third British Mount Everest expedition was gearing up to try once again to conquer the world's highest peak. George Mallory, a seasoned climber and the face of British mountaineering at the time, was leading the expedition. Mallory had already made 2 attempts on Everest, both unsuccessful. The mountain had proven too challenging, and time was running out before the monsoon season, which would make climbing impossible. But there was hope that this third attempt could finally succeed. Mallory's team needed climbers who not only had physical strength, but also technical expertise, especially when it came to the oxygen systems that were essential for surviving at Everest's extreme altitudes. These early oxygen sets were bulky and unreliable, prone to malfunction at the worst moments. This is where Irvine came in. His skill with machinery and his ability to improve and repair the oxygen sets made him an invaluable asset to the team. Though Irvine was young and relatively inexperienced in high-altitude climbing, Mallory saw something in him that made him the right choice. And so, on February 29, 1924, Irvine set sail for the Himalayas aboard the SS California, leaving from Liverpool. He traveled alongside 3 other members of the expedition, including Mallory. It was an adventure that would take them halfway around the world to a place that the few Westerners had ever seen up close. The towering, snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas. The sheer scale of the mountain, standing at 29,032 feet, was staggering. At the time, no human had ever stood at such an altitude, and the challenges of climbing it were beyond what anyone had experienced. The thin air made breathing difficult, and the extreme cold could kill in a matter of hours if the climbers weren't properly prepared. The British team was well equipped for the era, though by today's standards their gear would seem shockingly primitive. They wore heavy woolen clothing and hobnail boots, and their tents and supplies were carried by local porters, known as Sherpas. But it was the oxygen sets that Irvine had worked on that were the most important part of their equipment. Without extra oxygen, it was doubtful that anyone could survive long enough at the higher elevations to reach the summit. Once they arrived at Everest, the team set up a series of camps, each one higher than the last. These camps were designed to allow the climbers to acclimatize to the thinning air and to provide rest points during their ascent. The expedition made 2 earlier attempts to reach the summit in early June, but both were unsuccessful. Mallory and the other climbers battled fierce winds, deep snow, and freezing temperatures, only to be turned back before reaching the top. By early June, time was running out. The summer monsoon was fast approaching, and once it arrived, the weather would make climbing impossible until the next season. Mallory knew that they had one last chance to reach the summit before they would be forced to abandon the expedition. For this final push, Mallory made a surprising choice. He selected Irvine to be his partner for the summit attempt, bypassing the more experienced Noel Odell. Why did Mallory choose Irvine? Historians have debated this decision for years. Some believe that Irvine's expertise with the oxygen equipment made him the obvious choice. Mallory trusted Irvine to keep the oxygen sets functioning properly during the grueling climb. Others think that Mallory was simply impressed by Irvine's strength and determination, qualities that would be essential in the final stages of the climb. Whatever the reason, Mallory and Irvine set out together on June 6, 1924, from their high camp at 26,800 feet, determined to make history. On the morning of June 8th, Mallory and Irvine began their final push toward the summit. The climb was brutal. The northeast ridge of Everest is a jagged, exposed route with steep sections of rock and ice. The most difficult part of the climb is a series of steps, sharp rises in the ridge that require technical climbing skills to navigate. The second step, in particular, is a nearly vertical rock face that has challenged even the most skilled climbers in modern times. No one knows exactly what time Mallory and Irvine left their camp that day, but their movements were being closely watched by Noel Odell, who had stayed behind at a lower camp to act as support. At 12:50 p.m., Odell spotted them through his binoculars. He saw 2 tiny figures moving steadily up the ridge, going strongly for the top, as he later described. Odell believed they were climbing the second step, but in the years since, there has been debate about exactly where they were when he saw them. That brief glimpse was the last time anyone saw Mallory and Irvine alive. As the hours passed and the afternoon turned into evening, Odell waited anxiously for a signal that the 2 men had made it back to their camp. But no signal came. Night fell, and still there was no sign of them. By the next morning, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Mallory and Irvine had disappeared into the vast emptiness of Everest, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. A search party was quickly organized, but the mountain is unforgiving. The high altitudes, severe weather, and treacherous terrain made it nearly impossible to find any trace of the missing climbers. For the next several weeks, the team searched desperately, but there was no sign of Mallory or Irvine. It was as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. It wasn't until 9 years later, in 1933, that the first clue to their fate was discovered. During another British expedition to Everest, climber Percy Wynne Harris stumbled upon an ice axe lying on the rocks at around 27,760 feet. The axe was identified as belonging to either Mallory or Irvine, marking the last known point they had reached. It was the first solid evidence of their final climb, but it provided no answers about what had happened after that. Years passed, and the mystery of Mallory and Irvine's disappearance continued to haunt the climbing world. Did they make it to the summit before tragedy struck? Could they have been the first people in history to stand on the top of Everest? These questions remained unanswered, with only small clues emerging over time. But the biggest breakthrough came in 1999, when a research expedition led by Conrad Anker discovered George Mallory's body on the north side of the mountain. Mallory was lying face down in the snow, still wearing his climbing gear from that fateful day. There were signs that he had fallen, but whether it was from a great height or something else remained unclear. The discovery of Mallory's body reignited interest in the mystery of what happened to him and Irvine. Did they make it to the top before their tragic end? Some evidence suggested they might have. Mallory had always planned to leave a photograph of his wife on the summit, but no such photo was found with his body. And then there were his snow goggles, found in his pocket. indicating that he might have died during a nighttime descent. But without Irvine, and more importantly without the camera that he was carrying, the question remained unanswered. In the years since, many expeditions have set out to find Irvine's body, hoping to recover the camera that could provide definitive proof of whether or not they reached the summit. Some climbers have reported possible sightings of a body that might be Irvine's, but none have been confirmed. That is, until a startling discovery in September 2024 changed everything. It was a sunny day on the Central Rongbuk Glacier, far below the north face of Everest, when a team of filmmakers and climbers, led by famed mountaineer and Oscar-winning filmmaker Jimmy Chin, stumbled upon a weathered boot sticking out of the ice. The group was there to film a documentary for National Geographic, focused on a different aspect of the mountain's history. They weren't actively searching for Irvine. As Chin and his team moved closer, they noticed something else: a sock, poking out from the same spot. The cracked leather of the boot looked ancient, and the telltale diamond-shaped hobnails on the sole matched the style worn by climbers nearly a century ago. It was clear they had found something significant. When they lifted the sock, the group was astonished to see a red label sewn into the fabric. The label read, "A.C. Irvine." It was unmistakable. These were the partial remains of Sandy Irvine, the young climber who had vanished 100 years earlier alongside Mallory. The discovery left the team momentarily stunned. They had not expected to find Irvine, and certainly not in such a serendipitous way. The realization of what they were looking at hit them all at once. As Jimmy Chin later described it, the team was literally running in circles, dropping F-bombs. The emotions were raw and immediate. This wasn't just the discovery of an artifact, it was a piece of history, lost to the ice for a century. But what did this mean for the mystery that had captivated the world for so long? Did the discovery of Irvine's boot, sock, and partial remains provide any new clues about what had happened on that fateful day in June 1924? Irvine's boot was found at a lower altitude than where Mallory's body had been discovered in 1999. This fact alone raised intriguing possibilities. Had Irvine fallen separately from Mallory? Or had they fallen together, roped to one another as some evidence suggests, before Irvine's body was carried further down the mountain by an avalanche or the shifting glacier? The harsh, ever-changing conditions of Everest make it difficult to say for certain, but finding Irvine's remains was the biggest breakthrough in the mystery since Mallory's discovery. For years, climbers and historians have wondered if Irvine and Mallory might have reached the summit of Everest before their tragic fall. The location of Irvine's remains offers tantalizing new evidence, though it raises as many questions as it answers. If Irvine's body had been carried down the glacier, could the missing camera, believed to have been in his possession, still be nearby, hidden in the ice? The camera has been the holy grail of Everest exploration for decades. It was lent to Mallory and Irvine by fellow climber Howard Somerville, and it could contain photographic proof that the two men made it to the summit. If such evidence exists, it would rewrite the history of Everest, revealing that Mallory and Irvine conquered the world's highest peak 29 years before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay did in 1953. Jimmy Chin and his team knew the importance of the discovery. After finding the boot and sock, they immediately began a more detailed search of the surrounding area, hoping to uncover more remains, or, better yet, the elusive camera. As Chin later speculated, it's possible that the boot had only recently melted out of the glacier. If true, this could mean that more of Irvine's remains, or the camera, might soon emerge as the ice continues to shift and melt. But even without the camera, the discovery of Irvine's remains provides some degree of closure to the century-long mystery. For Irvine's family, especially his great-niece Julie Summers, this moment was deeply emotional. Summers, who had written a biography of Irvine and spent years championing his memory, was moved to tears when she heard the news. She had grown up hearing the story of her great-uncle Sandy, the brilliant young engineer who never returned from Everest. Now, finally, part of his story had come to light. For the climbing world, the discovery of Irvine's remains offers a new chapter in the Mallory-Irvine saga. While the exact details of their final hours on Everest may never be known, this discovery narrows the search area for the missing camera and provides hope that more artifacts could still be found. The location of Irvine's remains also challenges some earlier theories. For years, there was speculation that Irvine's body had been found by Chinese climbers during an expedition in 1975, and that they had possibly removed it from the mountain. This theory gained traction after some Chinese climbers reported seeing a body dressed in vintage clothing near the northeast ridge. However, the discovery of Irvine's boot and sock on the Central Rongbuk Glacier suggests that his body had likely been swept down the mountain by an avalanche or glacier movement, rather than being moved by humans. As we stand on the brink of the 100th anniversary of their disappearance, the legacy of Mallory and Irvine remains as powerful as ever. Whether or not they reached the top of Everest before their deaths may never be known for sure. But what is certain is that their story continues to inspire climbers, explorers, and dreamers alike.